All right, now it's time for step 3. So a little warning that I want to give you guys is that most of your grade comes from your work for step 3. If you were to only do step 1 and step 2, you would get at most 10 out of 100 points because that's just the setup. Maybe 15 points because you do have to do a little summary between step 1 and step 2. Step 3 is where 80 to 90 points of your 100 points is going to come from. That said, keep in mind that if you do not post both of your responses as outlined here, as I went over in the first video for this assignment document, you could lose half of the credit that you would otherwise actually earn. Okay, so now in step 3, you will objectively analyze the text in your argument constructions to discuss either a comparison or a difference. Previously, I had students do both a comparison and a difference, but to ease the intellectual workload and to allow you to focus on really manifesting excellence, I've decided to have you focus on just one. And you get to choose whether you want to focus on a comparison or a difference. And I'm going to provide a lot of explanation and detail. You might have questions about how you can do that. And I have lots of examples. I have 6 examples, but I also have some clarification that I will go over in this video as we work through the steps and the expectations here, where I elaborate on what I'm saying here in bold, but I'm also going to elaborate on the elaboration, provide warnings and tips and whatnot. That said, I want to go over another requirement that is not explicitly written here on this page, and that is a requirement that I'm now giving you. The requirement comes between steps 2 and step 3. And what I want you to do is type up a 1 to 3 sentence mini paragraph. It's almost just like a transitional sentence or 2, maybe 3, depending on the peer that you choose. And what you're going to do is create a standalone sentence or a set of sentences between step 2 and 3, where you iterate what conclusions you each reach. So you're not necessarily you're not explaining anything. You're just iterating. So while I know that you present your conclusion and your peer's conclusion in virtue of step 2, what we're doing is we're creating a nice little transition from step 2 to step 3. So make sure that you have that transition there. I do not have an example of that, but basically you just want to say something like, so I want to go over to, hold on, give me a second. So I'll give you a verbal example. So I'm not going to give you a written example of what I'm looking for between steps 2 and 3, but I'll give you a verbal example now. And that is, you could say you can say below step 2, but before step 3. So, I'm going to go over mistakes students make with respect to this part, but first let me give you the example. So after step 2, but before step 3, you could say something like, as you can see, I drew the conclusion that blah, blah, blah. This is the exact same conclusion that you drew, period. If you already quoted your own conclusion, then you do not need to quote to say that your peer also drew the same conclusion or presented the same conclusion. So you can do something like that. If you have different conclusions, you can say, as you can see in the quotes above, I concluded that, and then state what the conclusion is. And then you can say, while you concluded the opposite, or while you concluded that it was not the case. Or you could say, I concluded that I don't think blah, 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 and then you can type up what your conclusion exactly was, and then you can say, while you stated otherwise, that you do think it's the case. So that's like for opposing conclusions. If you have identical conclusions, then you can say, as you can see, we both reached the same conclusion, or you can say we both supported the same conclusion with our reasoning. But don't just say that, iterate, highlight, well, what was the conclusion? Okay, so you can say, as you can see, we reached the same conclusion. The conclusion we reached was blah, blah, blah. As you can see, we reached opposing conclusions. I concluded that. You concluded blah, blah, blah. As you can see, we both said it was not rational to draw a definite conclusion. And you can say we both said, and then quote the exact wording of that conclusion. You could say, as you can see, I stated that I don't think blah, 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 while your conclusion stated blah, blah, blah. I don't think it's rational. So you get the idea here. But this is a standalone part after step 2 and before step 3. What I've seen students do in the past is they merge that information where they're iterating the conclusions from step 2, they merge that into step 3. And this is a separate part. It needs to be between step 2 and step 3. So make sure it is not part of step 3, but comes right before step 3, its own little mini paragraph, if you will, or think of it as some transitional sentences if you think a paragraph should have more than a couple of sentences. All right, so now let's get to step 3. I have 6 examples of step 3. Please at least read through the examples. And as you read through the examples, know that I have only included steps 2 and 3 in the examples in task 4A of this assignment for this unit. Okay, please keep that in mind. I did not include step 1 of the examples, what comes in between step 1 and 2, what comes in between steps 2 and 3. But as you do read through those examples, look at how each of those examples follows all of the instructions and all of the expectations that I'm about to go over in step 3. That said, you can also follow the videos that go where I go over the examples. So again, when you get help from me, I do expect for you to follow all videos. So if you want help from me understanding the assignment, you do have to show me your notes from the videos that go over the examples. What I just said pertains to those of you who don't want to watch the videos. Just remember, then you're on your own in terms of figuring out how the examples work, because I've done my part by presenting the videos. But if you still need help after watching the example videos and taking notes, then yes, I would love to help you. All right, so let's focus on this. Objectively analyze the text in your argument constructions to discuss either a comparison or a difference. All right, so write this down. Notice that I have a lot of room here if you've printed this. If not, you can create notes, and so in your notes you could write like step 3, right? And then copy this, and then you could write in addition to, and just remember to always go back to this document online if you're writing notes on notebook paper because you didn't print this. So when I say objectively, this is so important, guys. So I want you to think about the importance here of intellectual empathy. Think about the lesson and lectures that I did on intellectual empathy, right? Remember, intellectual empathy is when you're aware of the need to, willing, and able to enter into a point of view to look at someone's reasoning, the logical structure of how they think, or the conceptual structure, their concepts, how they arrive at a conclusion, or to see how their concepts hang together. So this very assignment presupposes that you are able and willing to reflect intellectual empathy. If you do not, you can suffer the consequences of not getting a clear, accurate, and precise understanding of what your peer has to say. This could lead you to saying things that are inaccurate or saying things that distort what your peer has to say. So intellectual empathy is so important. Whether or not you agree with your peer, you are still reflecting intellectual empathy. And that is something that I stressed in the lecture on intellectual empathy, is that intellectual empathy is not about, saying that you agree or endorse what somebody thinks or feels or says. In fact, intellectual empathy has nothing to do with feelings or emotions, right? I lectured on that already. Intellectual empathy has to do with what I just stated, trying to understand someone's logic, their reasoning, their arguments, or their concepts, how they define them, their examples for those concepts, how they use those concepts, how those concepts hang together, the logic of the concepts. So you have to use intellectual empathy. That means that you are reflecting it, even if you choose a peer who reaches the same conclusion that you do. Even if you choose a peer whose reasoning in support of said conclusion is very similar to what you presented in your own argument. And also remember that you're reflecting and manifesting intellectual empathy in doing this assignment does not mean that you have to endorse what they say. It doesn't mean that you agree with what they say. I'm very concerned that some of you missed this in the Unit 3 test in terms of an item that was not true about manifesting intellectual empathy, and that is that intellectual empathy does not mean that you necessarily agree with somebody. It just means that you understand where they're coming from. Okay, so I say that with respect to the meaning of objectively analyze. Your ability to do the technical critical thinking of objective analysis is dependent on the subjective ability you have to manifest the character trait of good thinkers and learners, one being intellectual empathy. All right, so that said, and by the way, everything that I just lectured on with respect to objectively analyze and intellectual empathy, I might have as extra credit questions in the Unit 4 test. And in fact, I'm writing that down. Unit 4, guys, I'm actually writing this down. Extra credit questions based on lecture from this task. Okay, so another important point that I want to make with respect to, I kind of feel like I should have turned the camera around so you can see me, so I can just kind of lecture about this. Please, guys, I'm a hot mess because I haven't been feeling well, but I'm going to go ahead and show my face. Okay. Okay. Yes, who cares? Okay, learning's more important. Who cares what a hot mess I look like? So I just think that this would be better in terms of, feeling like you're more in a class. So here's like the classroom experience. Another thing that I want to iterate in this assignment, so please write this down, is that when I use the word objective, I also want to make sure that you understand that you are not to evaluate or judge in any way what your peer has to say in terms of saying things like, your argument is good, or I like, this is a good argument, your logic is good. There should be no evaluation of any kind. There should be no evaluative language. So I shouldn't see anything like, this is a good argument, your logic is compelling, your logic isn't good. There should be no critiques. So do not criticize your response in terms of saying, you did a good job with this, you did a bad job with this, you didn't do X, you didn't follow instructions. There should be none of that, okay? So again, no judgments or evaluations of any kind. So I shouldn't see any kind of that language. The other thing that I want you to not do is don't use the words agree or disagree. This assignment is not about whether you agree or disagree with a peer, and I'm going to get more into that in a moment, but write down that I should see no evaluative language. I shouldn't see anything about you saying that the work is good or bad, that it's missing a step, or that they didn't do something, or that they should have done something, and I shouldn't see any language about agreeing or disagreeing, because that's not what this is about, all right? Okay, so now I'm going to turn the camera around. Okay, so like I said, you'll focus on either a comparison or a difference. So some more stuff to write down. When I say comparison, I mean you're going to focus on how there's something alike across your responses, a similarity. Now, you can't say that your views are exactly the same, because they're not. If you look at them, you can see that you wrote up your response using different words, using different word combinations and whatnot. But you're saying that they are similar, that there is a major similarity. So words that you can use to tell me that you're focusing on a comparison is, of course, compare, similar, and alike. But do not use the word agree at all, okay? And then when it comes to a difference, really what I should have said here to be uniform with how I talk about this assignment down here is I should have used the word contrast. So if you printed this, cross out difference and type the word or write the word contrast. And then words that you can use, of course, to tell me that you're going to focus on a contrast include the word contrast itself. Of course, you can say a difference or dissimilar. Okay. Now, you're going to focus your discussion on the support your respective responses offer for the first statement and said responses. In doing so, take note of word and word phrases that name concepts playing a fundamental role in said logic. Okay, so if your peer did this assignment correctly, they should have one paragraph, and the first sentence should be the conclusion. When you are in step 3, you are not focusing on the conclusion itself. Okay, you already told me what your conclusions were by quoting quoting your responses, and then between step 2 and 3, you iterated what the conclusions are. By the time you get to step 3, you are focusing on what comes after your support for your conclusion. Of course, you're talking about your support relative to your respective conclusions, but you're not talking about or focusing on the conclusion itself. This is so important. Some students still do this. I don't know if it's because they don't read the instructions carefully or they don't follow the video to get the warnings and the tips, but it's very important for you to realize what you're supposed to be focusing on. Again, my examples provide a lot of clarity on what this looks like, so make sure you look at the examples here. A couple of your peers might not have followed my instructions exactly, so you might have a peer who stated the conclusion and then use the enter bar to create a space, and then they have a paragraph with their reasoning. So remember when I gave you the instructions for the Unit 1 assignment, I said that your conclusion should be in the same paragraph as your reasoning. Just be aware that some of your peers did not follow the instructions, so you might see that some peers have their conclusion and then they have their reasoning in like a separate set of sentences. Okay, so use the steps below to construct just one paragraph focused on one of the following: a comparison or a contrast. Reading through the examples is going to help you decide whether you want to focus on a comparison or a contrast, by the way. Okay, so now I have steps within step 3. So here I have step 3A. So there are, and again, this is exemplified in the examples. First, you will construct a sentence that makes a claim of comparison or contrast. This can take a variety of forms, so look at the examples to see 6 examples of how the first sentence might be set up in the examples, okay? This might even require 2 sentences, but look at the examples that I provide to see what this looks like. Okay, this tells me what you're going to focus on. A comparison or contrast, you can give the gist. And by the way, make sure that when you're presenting the conclusions or iterating the conclusions between steps 2 and 3, that you're not discussing anything yet. You're just presenting information or highlighting, iterating, emphasizing information. It's not to hear that you actually start to discuss. But what's important to realize here with step 3A is you're still not discussing, you are introducing the topic. Is it going to be a comparison or a contrast? Is it going to be a similarity or a difference? Is it going to be how your views are alike or how they're not alike? And of course, when you make this claim, it's not going to be about your conclusions, being alike or not alike or the same or different. It's going to be about the reasoning, the statements, the ideas, the logic that comes after the conclusion. Okay, so that's your first sentence, and this is all one paragraph. Step 3B. So the next, after 1 or 2 sentences for step 3A, you will present text-based evidence from each argument for your step 3A claim. This means that you should quote an entire statement or significant portion of a statement from each response. And by significant portion of a statement, please be careful. That's still going to be most or at least 75 to 80% of a given statement. Sometimes students don't quote enough, and so there's not enough compelling evidence, or the evidence that they could have used is not compelling because they didn't include enough from a statement. Here's another warning. Okay, so here's another warning. Remember how I defined statement during Unit 1 when I was making sure that you understand how we're using the word argument in this class. So you might need to go back to your notes for Task 3 of Unit 1, and it probably was Task 3A, as you download some documents with respect to argument construction. I gave you a definition for argument, and I gave you a definition for statement. So when I use the word statement, you got to remember all the warnings and tips I gave you in that lecture. So make sure that you don't quote the entire argument when you're doing step 3B. You should know what I mean by statement in the context of an argument in the context of this class. Okay, so so this is what comes next, right? Is each of your a claim from each of your arguments, and of course, this means this should not be the conclusion from each of your arguments, but it should be something that comes after your conclusion. Okay. Now, some of you might have what are called minor or sub-conclusions. I talked about that during Unit 1 when presenting the lesson on argument construction, and that's fine. You can use any statement that comes after your conclusion unless it's the first statement repeated in different words. So some of you might have made the rhetorical move of, you stated your conclusion as the first sentence in the paragraph, And then at the end of the paragraph, you restated your conclusion, paraphrased it, or just restated it verbatim. So that's the caveat. That's the warning I'm giving you. Is I said you can use right now any statement that comes after your first statement, right? But if one of your statements is the conclusion repeated, then you can't use that statement, right? Because you're supposed to focus on the reasoning you give in support of the conclusion. So keep that in mind. So that's really important. So you'll present text-based evidence from each argument. Okay, so then next in your paragraph, let me give you some warnings here. Make sure you use introductory clauses. You can't just plop down the quotes. You have to use an introductory clause. And I spoke about introductory clauses for quoted material when I went over the lesson for arguments by definition. And I told you that you can't just plop down a quote from a dictionary. I said you have to introduce it, use proper writing mechanics. So again, look at the examples, the 6 examples, to see what I mean by an introductory clause. How can you introduce quoted material into this discussion from your responses? Don't just plop down a quote. Also, big warning. Here, you do have to use quotation marks. Use quotation marks to show me where your evidence is. If you don't, there's going to be a major deduction for that. Why is that? This helps me to more quickly see where your quoted evidence is. If you don't put quotation marks within the discussion paragraph, then it's harder for me to spot where the quote is and where your paraphrasing is. So you must use quotation marks for step 3B when you're quoting yourself and when you're quoting your peer. And you have to quote a statement from your own paragraph and a statement from your peer. So that's a very important as well. Big warning. I hope you write that down. Okay, so what you could do is you could go ahead and work on this assignment and then come back to this video when you're ready to listen to this part. Like I said, step 3, with respect to these more general steps, this is where most of the points are earned. Now within step 3 for this page of this assignment document, most of the points are earned here for step 3C. So when it comes to step 3 itself, I would say that 80% of the points within step 3 itself are earned here, okay? So let's just say you do step 1, 2, the missing pieces, you do step 3A and 3B. The most points you're probably going to get is maybe 20 or 30 points. That's it, because you haven't done the most important part, which is to now argue in effect for the claim based on your evidence that your views compare or contrast in some way. So like I said, if you want to, you can pause now, work on the assignment, and then come back when you're ready to get warnings and tips. And keep in mind that the examples are good. The examples that I give you, they're all B+ and A level examples, but I might go over additional things in this video here. So make sure you come back to this video if you pause. Okay, so step 3C. Now convince your peer that the wording in the step 3B textual evidence really does show there is a way in which your written responses compare and contrast. Okay, so a huge mistake that some students make, and it's gotten better over time now that I've posted the videos. I've learned how to word this assignment to reduce the number of students making this mistake. But a big mistake that some students make is that they respond as though they're having a conversation in the present moment, where they're saying things like what they do is merely elaborate on what they themselves think, or they try to argue with their peer. You are not arguing with your peer in the moment of writing this assignment. It's more like it's a text-based analysis. It's almost like if you're reading a piece of literature and you're supposed to talk about the text in that piece of literature, like a literary analysis almost, okay? But you're doing it with my instructions in the context of this class in philosophy. It's an objective analysis. But everything you say has to be based on what was said in the past. Everything you say in step 3C has to be about what you wrote down in those arguments at that time, right? So keep in mind that there is room for interpretation, but the interpretation has to be based on what you said in that moment of time, in your quoted paragraph, in your quoted statement, and likewise for your peer. So be careful not to write your response, your analysis in such a way that you come off as having a conversation about the topic in the moment, that you come off as arguing with your peer in the moment, This is not a present ongoing conversation. It's a deep dive into recorded text from the past. It's text-based analysis. You're not still giving your opinion at the moment. You're not still elaborating on the topic. You are discussing, interpreting, making sense of something that was already written down in the past. Very important. Okay, so notice that I say convince your peer that the wording in the step 3B textual evidence really does show. So this is where we see that really what I'm trying to get you to do is, even though I said you're not arguing with your peer, what I meant by that is you're not arguing with your peer about the topic of free will and wearing a mask in a grocery store. That's what I meant with that. You're not arguing with your peer about the philosophical problem of free will or the practical or political or ethical problem or metaphysical problem about whether or not you're wearing a mask of your own free will in a grocery store. So that's what I meant by you're not arguing with your peer. Now, what you are doing in terms of argument is you are presenting, in effect, an argument to your peer that there really is a comparison or a contrast. So in effect, your first sentence for step 3 of this assignment is a conclusion, right? That there is a comparison or there is a contrast. And then the reasoning begins with step 3B because you're offering text-based evidence from your original responses for your claim in step 3A. So this evidence is already part of your reasoning in support of step 3A. And then step 3C is where you offer more reasoning using step 3B. So step 3C is where you convince your peer that this evidence really does support step 3A. So in a way, this reasoning supports this here, the implicit claim being that this is evidence for something. So in a way, this is kind of a minor or sub-conclusion on that supports this main conclusion. So this is where most of the writing and thinking occurs. You're explaining and elaborating on how the ideas expressed in your step 3 pieces of evidence. And by that, I should have said, add right here, step 3B pieces of evidence justify a given claim of comparison or contrast. By justify, really do support, really does show that there is some kind of contrast or comparison. This explanation, elaboration, or defense requires at least 3 sentences for your step 3 claim of comparison or contrast. And honestly, you'll see the examples. You're probably going to want to write more than 3 sentences just for this part after 3A and 3B. Said sentences should be focused, exact, and relevant to defending, explaining, elaborating on how the wording in the quoted step 3 pieces of evidence really do provide at least plausibility that there is a given comparison or contrast. Okay, so some more warnings, some more coaching, some more tips is when you are using those quoted statements from each of your arguments, right, is you have to be careful to keep the context of those quoted statements in mind. So sometimes what students will do in real life or in an assignment, what any of us might do, and you definitely see this in social media, Facebook arguments and stuff like that, is people will take claims and statements that people make and take them out of context. And when that happens, it's easy to distort and misrepresent what somebody might say. So guys, this is like high-level critical thinking. Okay, so philosophy helps you with your critical thinking, and critical thinking helps you with philosophy. And by the way, I'm going to do a mini lecture, and you can give me a 2-sentence summary for an extra credit bonus point on this. It's philosophers who are credited with giving rise to what we now call critical thinking, beginning with the pre-Socratics and then as well developed and underway by the time of Socrates and Plato. Philosophers begin to ask questions. Before, we used to rely on the poets who wrote up these myths or verbalized these myths and carried down these myths through an oral tradition and then in writing. And they would, if somebody said, hey, why is it thundering? Somebody said, well, Zeus is clapping his hands. But then the pre-Socratics started to ask questions like, is that really the case? Is there really some dude named Zeus who has hands that's clapping? Does that really explain reality of thunder? And so it's in virtue of asking questions that philosophy was born. Not only that, but philosophy became so interested in asking these questions about reality and truth and knowledge that philosophy itself was deemed worthy of propagation. Propagation, think of propaganda, but not exactly the same. Propaganda has a negative connotation. Look up the word propagation. Give me the meaning of that word and tell me how it relates to the lecture I just did. But it's considered worthy of propagation. And it's actually a philosophy that gives rise to what we now call critical thinking. And it started with questions, questioning what people told us. So it's interesting to think about that. Have you ever thought about that? Like, do you think cavemen were doing critical thinking? You know, did dinosaurs do critical thinking? Where did critical thinking come from? Well, it comes from human experience, especially as informed by philosophy. Okay, so enough with that lecture. So the warning. Oh shoot, I was going to give you a warning. So let me look at the instructions again. Sentences should be okay. All right. So the thing that I want to emphasize here is that you are doing a high level of critical thinking here, right? So you have to really engage with this, take this very seriously. Mind you, I'm only asking you to do one paragraph here. So keep in mind that because there is only one paragraph, a lot is writing on this one paragraph. You still have to do all the other steps. You can't just give me this one paragraph. All of the steps, including those for step 3, step 2, step 1, and the stuff that I tell you to include between step 1 and step 2 and step 2 and step 3, all of those are really important. A piece of advice, kind of a warning, is that sometimes students, like I said, yeah, that's what I was saying. Make sure that whatever you're discussing and saying about what all is in each, the wording in each of the statements, make sure that you keep the context of the argument for each of your claims, for each of your quoted pieces of information in mind. In other words, don't misrepresent what your peer said in your working with the evidence from your peer's claim and you as well, right? It should not, what you say about the peer's claim should be plausible, okay? Should not forget the context, the larger piece of reasoning from which it comes. The other thing I want to say is that often students don't unpack the quoted material as much as they could. They barely say anything about the quoted material. There is a lot that you can do when you quote an entire statement or a significant portion of a statement. So you really have to dig deep and really use your critical thinking and imaginative and interpretation skills to unpack the quoted material. Again, please look at the examples to see how much unpacking, how much discussion can happen with respect to just 2 pieces of quoted evidence. You'll also see some variation in how you can pull a little bit from other parts of the argument. The idea, however, is that you're focusing mostly on one significant claim from your response and one significant claim from your peer's response in the form of a statement or a significant portion of a statement.